Margaret Calloway hit the frozen ground the moment the first shot cracked through the blizzard behind her. Not a warning shot. The bullet took the fence post beside her head and sent splinters into her cheek. She pressed her father's satchel flat against her body, got her knees under her, and ran. Her boots had no grip on the ice. She fell twice, got up twice. Behind her, through the white wall of snow and wind, a man's voice called out. Calm, almost conversational. "Bring me the bag, Miss Calloway. You can keep the rest." She ran harder. If your heart is already hammering, you're exactly where I need you. Subscribe to this channel, hit the bell, and drop a comment right now telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Stay with me, because what happens in the next hour will change everything you think you know about desperation, courage, and the kind of love that starts in the middle of a blizzard with a dead man's evidence and nowhere left to run. She came through the door of Garrison's general store at a dead run and put her back against it before the bell above the frame stopped ringing. 3 seconds. She gave herself exactly 3 seconds to breathe and read the room. 2 men at the wood stove playing cards, not interested. A heavy-set man behind the counter, interested but slow. A woman near the dry goods, already moving away. One back hallway, one window facing the street, one man at the far end of the counter who had not moved at all, but whose eyes had tracked her from the moment she came in. That last one was the variable she hadn't accounted for. "Doors stay shut in my store," the man behind the counter said. "Heat costs money." "I apologize." She kept her voice flat and even. Her cheek was bleeding where the fence splinter had cut her. She did not touch it. "I need a warm coat, gloves, and whatever you have in women's boots. Whatever you have that fits. I'll pay." She put $3 silver on the counter without being asked. The man behind the counter, Briggs, she'd find out later, Carl Briggs, who had been selling short measures and long prices to Garrison's residents for 11 years, looked at the coins and changed his entire posture. "I'll see what we have in the back," he said. She did not move away from the door. She counted seconds in her head the way her father had taught her. 1,000, 2,000, and watched the window and tried to calculate how much distance she had bought herself in the storm. "The cut on your cheek." The voice came from her left, low and even, not loud enough to carry to the card players. "That's a wood splinter, not a fall injury."
Splinter pattern like that comes from a bullet hitting something close.
She turned her head slowly. The man at the end of the counter was maybe 34, lean and dark-haired, with a kind of stillness that didn't come from being relaxed. It came from being trained. He hadn't moved toward her or away from her. He was simply watching her the way a man watches something he hasn't decided about yet. "I don't know what you're referring to," she said. "Ma'am." He said it quietly, not condescending, almost careful. "I've been standing in this store for 20 minutes, waiting on a pound of coffee. In that time, not one person came through that door at a dead run. Not one person bled on Briggs' floorboards." A pause. "And not one person looked at every exit in this room before they looked at a single person's face." She held his gaze, gave him nothing. "I'm Caleb Hargrove," he said. "I have a ranch 7 miles west. I used to work for the Pinkerton Agency, which means I know the difference between a woman running from trouble she caused and a woman running from trouble that hunted her down." He glanced at the window, then back to her. "You're the second kind." "You don't know anything about me." "No, ma'am, I don't. But I know that whoever's behind you will reach this town inside 10 minutes in this weather." He kept his eyes steady on hers. "And the only man in Custer County with the authority to do anything about it is Sheriff Dale Weston." The name hit her like cold water. He saw it. She watched him see it. Watched something shift behind his eyes. Not satisfaction, not pity. Recognition. "Then you already know," he said quietly, "that walking into Weston's office is not an option." Briggs came back from the rear of the store with a dark green wool coat, heavy and long. "Best I've got in a woman's cut, $6.
"I'll cover the difference," Caleb said, and put the coins on the counter before she could object. She looked at him sharply. "It's not charity," he said. "I'm buying 30 seconds of your attention, that's all." She pulled on the coat, buttoned it with hands that were steady because she made them steady, because her father had told her 17 years ago that the most important thing a person could do in a crisis was decide to be calm and then act like it until the calm became real. She picked the satchel up from between her feet. She had kept it there since she walked in, never out of contact, and held it against her body. "Margaret Calloway," she said, her voice just above a whisper. "My father was Thomas Calloway. He was a lawyer. He was investigating land fraud in this county." She met his eyes and did not look away. "They killed him 3 weeks ago and called it a lamp fire. They killed his partner and called it a riding accident. I have his files. Every forged deed, every falsified transfer, every letter between Voss and Weston going back 2 years." Her jaw was tight. "That is what's behind me." Caleb was quiet for 2 full seconds. "All right," he said. "Come with me. We go out the back." The gray mare he put her on was named Patience, and deserved the name. The animal drove through drifts without complaint, while the blizzard closed around them like a fist. Caleb rode close enough that she could hear him when he spoke, which he did sparingly, asking only what he needed to know. She told him the shape of it on the ride. Not everything. She had learned in the past 3 weeks that information given too fast to the wrong person was a death sentence. But enough. Her father had taken the case 6 months ago. A rancher named Elias Pruitt, whose deed had been transferred to a company called Northern Meridian Land Company without his knowledge. Thomas Calloway had started pulling the thread. 1 case became 3, became 9, became 19. 19 ranches, Caleb said, in Custer County alone. 19 families who either signed documents they don't remember signing or never signed anything and found themselves legally dispossessed. She raised her voice against the wind. "The mechanism is Harlan Voss, Northern Meridian's attorney. He has access to the county recorder's office through Weston. Deeds get altered. Signatures get copied from legitimate documents and transferred. By the time a rancher understands what's happened, the legal standing is already gone. And fighting it requires resources most frontier families don't have." "Exactly. My father had resources. And he had me." She paused. "He'd been training me since I was 12. Land contracts, deed law, notary procedure. He said the law needed more people who could read what was actually written instead of what someone claimed was written." Caleb said nothing for a moment. The horses pushed through a drift and found flatter ground. "The lamp fire," he said, carefully. Her hands tightened on the reins. "I was supposed to be in the office that night. I'd stayed late to finish copying documents. He sent me home early because it was raining." A beat, 1 breath. "He saved my life and didn't know it was the last thing he'd ever do for me." The wind filled the silence between them. "I'm sorry," Caleb said. It was 2 words, and he said them simply, without decoration, and she found, to her own surprise, that they landed differently than the same words had from every other person who'd said them in the past 3 weeks. Everyone else had said, "I'm sorry," and immediately started telling her what she should do next. He said it and then stayed quiet, giving it room to... She did not trust that. Not yet. But she noted it. "The marshal's office in Billings," she said, pulling herself back to the problem. "I tried. They told me to file a report with the county sheriff." The humorless sound that came out of her wasn't quite a laugh. "That's when I understood how deep it went." "Helena," Caleb said. "Federal District Court. Independent of county jurisdiction." 2 days in good weather. 5 in this. He looked at the sky, then back at the trail ahead. "We get to the ranch, we get warm, and we figure out how to move those documents to Helena without getting killed. Together. You understand that word? Together means both of us decide, not just me." She looked at him sideways through the snow. "I was going to say the same thing to you." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. Gone in an instant. The ranch house was bigger than she'd expected, and better built. Inside, he got the stove lit, while she stood in the main room and read the space the way she read everything. Systematically. Bookshelves with working volumes, not decorative ones. A desk with organized papers. A Pinkerton Agency certificate on the wall, dated 1871. And on the desk, folded, a letter with Northern Meridian Land Company letterhead, visible at the top crease. She turned around. He was watching her from the kitchen doorway. "They've come for your land too," she said. 3 months ago." He moved to check the stove damper. "Voss came himself to deliver the offer. Said Northern Meridian was prepared to pay fair market value. When I declined, he mentioned that the county had recently discovered irregularities in my original homestead filing." He said it without anger, which she found more unsettling than anger would have been. "My father filed that claim in 1861. I have every original document." "Meaning they've already started building the forged case against you." "That's my read." She opened the satchel. The documents came out in order. She had sorted and labeled everything over 2 days of running. Her father's system, the one he drilled into her until it was reflex. Original deed, forged copy, correspondence. "Sit down," she said. "I want to show you something." He sat across from her without hesitation. No performance of authority, no suggestion that he should be the one directing this. He simply sat down and looked at what she put in front of him. She pointed to the notary seal on the forged Pruitt deed. "This transfer document supposedly records Elias Pruitt signing his ranch over to Northern Meridian in March of last year." She looked up. "Elias Pruitt died in February. His widow was in Kansas by March and has signed nothing." Caleb leaned in. His eyes moved across the document with the focused attention of someone who had spent years learning to read what papers actually said. "The seal date," he said. 4 days before the signature date. The notary certified a document before it was signed, which means the seal was copied from another document and applied here. He looked up at her. "You have the source?" She pulled 2 more pages from the stack and set the seals side by side. 1876 legitimate transfer. Same notary. The seal impression is identical down to a hairline crack in the lower left quadrant. She pointed. "You can't reproduce that crack by accident or by re-inking. You reproduce it by pressing the exact same physical seal onto both documents." He studied the 2 pages for a long moment. Longer than she expected. When he looked up, something had shifted in his expression. Not the controlled assessment he'd worn since the store. Something rawer. "How many of the 19 deeds use this seal?" he asked. 14. He was quiet. He looked at the documents on the table, and then he looked away, toward the dark window, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked like a man who was carrying weight rather than managing it. His hand, resting on the table near the documents, closed slowly into a loose fist and then opened again. "My neighbor to the north," he said. "Pete Alderman,
Ranched here 20 years. His wife wrote to me 2 months ago saying the county had sent a man about some paperwork confusion with their deed. He kept looking at the window. I told her it was probably a recording error, that it would get sorted. A pause. She wrote again last month to say they'd been told to vacate. The fire crackled in the stove. I told her it would get sorted, he said again, quieter, like a man hearing himself say something he should have heard differently the first time. Maggie did not rush to fill the silence. She understood this particular kind of weight, the specific heaviness of realizing that what you thought was a manageable problem was never manageable, that people were already hurt while you were still deciding whether to be alarmed. "It's not your fault," she said, not as comfort, as fact. "I should have looked harder. They're very good at what they do. That's the point." She pushed the correspondence page toward him. "This is a letter from Northern Meridian's Chicago director to Voss, dated 14 months ago. It authorizes what they call expedited acquisition by any means necessary. It names Weston by name and badge number as a contracted asset." She met his eyes. "Your neighbor, my father, every rancher on that list. None of them could have known, because it was designed so they couldn't know. Until it was too late." He read the letter, read it again. When he set it down, the rawness in his face was gone. What replaced it was something colder and more deliberate, the particular expression of a man who had just decided something. "Your father trained you to do this," he said. "Since I was 12. He was right to." He said it simply, as a statement of fact, the way he'd said "I'm sorry" on the trail, without decoration, without condescension, just the plain truth of it. These documents, in the right hands, in Helena, this ends Weston. This ends Voss. This ends Northern Meridian's operation in this territory. Yes. And you've been carrying them alone for 3 weeks. There was no one else. He looked at her for a long moment, not at the documents, not at the satchel, at her. And she made herself hold it, because she had learned to hold the gaze of men who were deciding things, and not show them what it cost her. "You said you needed a safe place for 2 days," he said, "and that those riders won't find you here." "Yes. I can keep you safe. I know this land in the dark, and in a storm, and in worse than both. Any man Weston sends onto this property uninvited will regret it." He paused. "But I need you to understand something, Miss Calloway. If they tracked you here, if they know your direction, they'll come. And when they do, I stop being a man with a land dispute and start being a man harboring a witness and evidence in a murder case. My situation becomes as dangerous as yours." "I know that." "Do you?" "Yes." She kept her voice even. "I know exactly what I'm asking you to risk. I'm not asking you to do it out of gratitude or charity. I'm asking because you have the same enemy I have, the same threat sitting on your desk. And the documents in this satchel are the only thing that can stop Northern Meridian from taking everything your father built, and everything you've spent your life building on top of it." She held his gaze. "I'm not bringing you a burden, Mr. Hargrove. I'm bringing you the proof you don't have. We need each other. That's the plain truth of it." The fire settled in the stove. The blizzard pressed against the walls of the house. Caleb Hargrove looked at her the way a man looks at something that has just surprised him, and she got the impression that not many things surprised him. "Room upstairs, second door on the right," he said. "Lock works. You'll be warm." He stood and reached for his coat. "I'm going to check the perimeter and put the horses up properly. When I come back, we plan the route to Helena together. Every decision, both of us. No exceptions." "Agreed." He buttoned his coat and moved toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame. "Miss Calloway." She looked up. "Your father." His voice was level but deliberate, the way a man sounds when he's choosing to say something he doesn't have to say. He raised someone who ran 3 weeks with killers behind her, and still had the presence of mind to organize the evidence by date and notary seal. He paused. Whatever else happened, he did that right. He went out into the dark before she could answer. Maggie sat alone at the kitchen table with her father's documents spread before her, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she felt something ease. Not safety, not yet, not even close, but the particular relief of no longer being entirely alone with an impossible thing. She reached into the bottom of the satchel and took out the letter. Oilcloth wrapped, soft from handling. She knew every word. She didn't need to open it. But she held it the way you hold something that is the last physical warmth of a person who is gone. And she allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to do that. Her father's rule, always. 30 seconds to feel it, then back to work. And then she put it away. She picked up the notary seal comparison page, smoothed it flat, and reached for the pen she kept in her coat pocket. There was a man walking the perimeter of this ranch in a January blizzard, so she could sit at a lit table and work safely. She was not going to waste a single minute of it. Outside, the snow fell heavier than ever, burying tracks and muffling sound and closing the world down to this one house, these 2 people, and the documents on the table that were either going to save them both or get them killed. By morning, they would find out which. Caleb came back in from the cold 40 minutes later, snow on his shoulders and something different in his eyes. Maggie had not moved from the table. She had the documents reorganized into 3 separate groups: evidence of the forged mechanism, evidence of Weston's direct involvement, and the Northern Meridian correspondence. And she was working through the 3rd group with the pen, annotating dates and cross-referencing names in the margins the way her father had taught her. Build the chain, Maggie. Every link visible, every link provable. A chain with one weak link isn't a chain. It's a rope waiting to break. Caleb hung his coat on the peg by the door and stood for a moment, looking at what she had done to his kitchen table. "You reorganized," he said. 3 categories: forgery mechanism, direct culpability, and corporate authorization. If we get to Helena and have 5 minutes with a federal judge, you want him to be able to see the whole picture in the order that makes the most legal sense. She did not look up. "I didn't touch anything on your desk." "I didn't think you did." He moved to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee, set one beside her without asking, and sat down across from her with the other. "No tracks on the north perimeter. Storm's covering everything fast. If those 2 riders made it into Garrison, they're staying put tonight. Nobody's tracking in this." "They'll start again at first light." "Yes." He wrapped both hands around his cup, "which gives us until approximately 2 hours after dawn before they find where you came from and start following it west." He looked at the documents. "Tell me about the route to Helena. What do you know?" She set down the pen. "The most direct route is north through the Musselshell Valley and then west. 4 days in normal conditions. The problem is the Northern Pacific Survey Road runs parallel for about 60 miles of that route. Northern Meridian has been using that corridor for their acquisition teams. It's how their men move fast across the territory." "So the direct route puts us on their road." "For too long, yes. The alternative is south first, then west through the Beartooth foothills, then north again into Helena. It adds a day and a half, maybe 2, and the mountain section is hard going in January." She looked at him steadily. "But nobody from Northern Meridian would expect a witness heading to Helena to go south first." He was quiet, thinking. She watched him think, and noted that he did it without filling the silence, which was rarer than people understood. "The Beartooth section," he said.
There's a relay station at the Eastern Pass. Man named Silas Croft runs it. He's been supplying my ranch for 4 years. He's not connected to Weston or Northern Meridian." He paused. "He also owes me a significant favor from the winter of '77 that I've never called in." "What kind of favor?" "His youngest son got into serious trouble with a pair of claim jumpers north of Billings. The kind of trouble that ends with somebody dead and somebody hanged." Caleb said it without drama. "I was still with Pinkerton at the time. I was able to clarify certain facts about who threw the first punch in a way that kept the boy from a rope." Maggie looked at him. "You left Pinkerton in '78. "That's right." "Why?" He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. It was the first question she'd asked him that wasn't operationally necessary, and they both knew it. "Because Pinkerton takes contracts from whoever pays," he said. "For 6 years, I told myself the work was about justice, finding the truth, protecting people, building cases that held up." A pause. "Then they put me on a labor action in Pennsylvania. Coal miners. They wanted me to document organizers so the company could dismiss them and blacklist them across the industry." He set the cup down. These were men with families. Men who were asking for the basic dignity of not dying in a hole in the ground for someone else's profit. His voice stayed level, but something underneath it had an edge. "I filed my resignation the same day I filed a report with the miners' union about what Pinkerton had been hired to do." Maggie was quiet for a moment. "That must have cost you." "They made it difficult for a while. But a man who knows how to find things out also knows how to make certain information inconvenient for the people who want to harm him." Something that might have been dark humor moved briefly across his face. "We reached an arrangement." She looked at him. Really looked at him. The way she'd been avoiding doing because she understood instinctively that this man was the kind of person you could look at too long and start making decisions that had nothing to do with logic. She pulled her eyes back to the documents. "The south route through the Beartooth," she said. "How soon can we leave?" "Not tonight. Not in the storm with those horses. Dawn, once I can see what the weather's doing." He leaned forward, forearms on the table. "But there's something we need to talk about before then." She waited. "Those riders behind you. If they're Weston's regular deputies, they'll track you here, find the ranch empty, and go back to Weston for instructions. That gives us time." His eyes were direct. "But if they're outside contractors, if Voss brought in professional trackers, the way your father documented he'd done before, they won't wait for instructions. They'll follow the trail south, and they'll move fast." "I know." "Then you know what I'm asking." "You want to know how dangerous the men behind me actually are?" "Yes." She folded her hands on the table. "The man who shot at me tonight, not a warning shot, he was shooting to hit. He was too far back in the storm for a clean look. But the way he moved through the drifts, the way he called out to me after the shot." She paused. "He wasn't panicked. He wasn't angry. He was working." She met Caleb's eyes. "Your professional contractors don't get angry, and they don't warn. They work." Caleb was silent for a full 5 seconds. "Then we leave before first light," he said. 2 hours before dawn. I'll have the horses ready and enough supplies for 7 days in the mountains." "That's more than we need. That's what we're taking." He said it without room for argument, but not without reason. "Because if something goes wrong on the Beartooth section, and we lose a day to weather or injury, we don't want to be calculating whether we can afford to stop." She considered arguing. She decided not to. It was the right call. "There's something else," she said. He looked at her. "Your neighbor, Pete Alderman. You said his wife wrote that they'd been told to vacate." She pulled one document from the second group, the direct culpability stack, This is the transfer deed for the Alderman Ranch. Signed, notarized, recorded in October. She pointed to the signature. That is not Pete Alderman's signature. Caleb looked at the document. His jaw tightened. I know his handwriting, he said quietly. He and my father corresponded for years. That P. Pete always crossed the loop on his capital P. Always. His father taught him that way.
The forger didn't know that.
No. He stared at the page. No, they didn't. When we reach Helena, this deed is part of the case. The Alderman land transfer, the Pruitt transfer, 11 others with provable signature discrepancies. She kept her voice steady and factual because she could see what looking at this document was doing to him, and she understood that the most useful thing she could do for him right now was give him the problem to solve, rather than the grief to sit in. Every one of those families has a legal basis to reclaim their land if we can get a federal judge to issue a halt order on Northern Meridian's operations while the forgeries are investigated. And Weston? Weston goes to federal prison. So does Voss. She paused. The Chicago director, depending on how a jury reads any means necessary, that's less certain. But the operation in this territory ends. He looked up from the document, and she saw something in his face that she recognized because she had seen it in her own reflection 3 weeks ago. The moment when grief and fury stop competing with each other and settle into something colder and more useful. My father built this ranch for 30 years, he said. He came here with $40 and a mule, and he filed that claim in '61, when there was nothing out here but grass and weather. He worked himself to an early grave, making something out of nothing. He pushed the alderman deed back toward her, slowly and deliberately. And these men in Chicago think they can take what he built with a pen and a crooked seal? That's exactly what they think. They're wrong. Yes, she said, they are. And I can prove it. She held his gaze. But only if we get to Helena. And only if we get there together. Because you know the mountain route, and I know the documents. And neither of us can do this without the other. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table, not toward her, toward the pile of documents, and straightened the stack with both hands, carefully, the way a person handles something they've decided to treat as important. Get some sleep, he said. I'll wake you at 4. I don't sleep well. Neither do I. He stood and picked up both coffee cups, moved to refill them. So we'll sit here for a while, and you can tell me about your father. Not the lawyer, the man. He set the full cup back beside her. If you're willing. She looked at him. The question surprised her. Not because it was intrusive, but because it wasn't. It was offered the way he offered everything, plainly, with a clean exit available if she didn't want it. He was funny, she said. It came out before she decided to say it. People always expected him to be serious, because he was serious about the work. But at home he told terrible jokes. The kind with a punchline made no sense, but he laughed so hard at his own jokes that you laughed anyway. She stopped, pressed her lips together. He could quote Shakespeare and fix a wagon wheel, and he made the best coffee I have ever tasted in my life. And I have been drinking terrible coffee for 3 weeks. This coffee is also terrible, Caleb said. She looked at the cup, took a sip. Yes, she said, it is. My mother's recipe. She believed coffee should be strong enough to stand a spoon in vertically. He sat back down. She was wrong about this, and right about almost everything else. Maggie almost smiled. Not quite, but adjacent to it. Tell me about your father, she said. And so they sat in the warming kitchen, while the blizzard worked at the walls of the house, and they talked. Not about Helena, or deeds or murder, but about the people who had made them who they were. Caleb talked about his father, Daniel Hargrove,
who had filed that homestead claim in '61, with $40 and a belief that a man who worked hard enough and dealt honestly enough could build something that lasted. Who had taught his son to track and to read and to tell the difference between a man who needed help and a man who needed stopping. Who had died of a fever in '74 at 53 years old, 2 weeks before the first good cattle season the ranch had ever had. He never saw it pay off, Caleb said. My father never saw this case close, Maggie said. They looked at each other across the table. Then we finish it for them, Caleb said. Simple as that. No decoration. Yes, she said. We do. It was close to midnight when Maggie finally admitted she needed sleep, and Caleb showed her upstairs to the second door on the right. The room was plain and cold, but the bed had 2 thick quilts, and the lock on the door was solid. She had her hand on the door when he said, from the hallway behind her, Miss Calloway? She turned. He was holding out the Pinkerton certificate from the wall downstairs. She looked at it, confused. I want you to have this tonight, he said. Not as a trophy or a credential. Just so you know, when I tell you I understand what it means to build a case in a corrupt system, when I tell you I've been in rooms with dangerous men and come out the other side with the truth intact, I'm not telling you what you want to hear. He held her gaze. I'm telling you what I know. She took the certificate, looked at it, looked at him. Get some sleep, she said. We leave at 4. Something moved in his face, that almost smile again, there and gone. Yes, ma'am. She went inside and locked the door and stood in the dark for a moment with the certificate in one hand and the satchel in the other. And she thought about her father, and about long odds, and about the specific feeling of standing in a stranger room, in a stranger's house, in the middle of a Montana blizzard, with killers on your trail and a federal case in your bag, and, for the first time in 3 weeks, one person on your side who understood exactly what all of it meant. She set the satchel on the floor where she could feel it with her foot, lay down fully dressed on top of the quilts, meant to stay awake, was asleep in 4 minutes. Downstairs, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with the documents she had left organized in 3 neat stacks and read every single page by lamplight. He read slowly and carefully, the way his father had taught him to read anything important, not for what you expected to find, but for what was actually there. He found Pete Alderman's name on 3 separate documents. He found his own ranch listed in a Northern Meridian acquisition schedule dated 2 months ago, flagged as a priority target. And he found in the very last letter in the corporate correspondence stack a line that made him go very still. It was in the postscript of the Chicago director's most recent letter to Voss, dated 6 weeks ago. The Calloway matter. Ensure completion before the daughter reaches a jurisdictional boundary. She has the copies. She is the only remaining problem. He read it twice. Then he got up quietly, checked every lock on every window and door in the house, loaded the rifle he kept above the kitchen door, and the second one he kept in the back room, and put on a fresh pot of terrible coffee. He was not going to sleep tonight. At 4 in the morning, he knocked twice on the second door on the right. I'm awake, her voice came back immediately, clear and steady, not the voice of someone just woken. She had probably been awake for an hour. Horses are ready. Coffee's on. A pause, then, is the coffee still terrible? Worse than last night. Good, she said. I'll be down in 2 minutes. He heard her moving, quick, efficient, no wasted motion. And he went back downstairs and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark where the snow had finally stopped falling and the temperature had dropped hard, and the tracks they were going to leave heading south would be visible in the moonlight to anyone who came looking. They needed to move fast. When she came downstairs, the satchel was across her body, and her coat was buttoned,
and she had that he recognized as one of his own from the peg by the door. She had taken it without asking, which he found, against all practical consideration, inexplicably and entirely correct.
"You read the rest of the correspondence," she said. Not a question. She had seen immediately that the stack had been moved. "Yes." "Then you saw the postscript?" "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "They're not going to stop." "No," he said. "They're not." "Then neither are we." She picked up the coffee cup he'd left on the counter for her, drank it down in 2 long swallows, set the cup back without making a face, despite the fact that it was genuinely terrible, and walked to the door. "Let's go," she said. They rode south into a cold so deep it had its own sound, a high, thin silence that pressed against the ears like held breath. The moon was still up, casting the snow in blue-white light, and Maggie understood immediately why Caleb had wanted to leave before dawn. In this light, on this terrain, they could move fast and see trouble coming from a distance. The same light that exposed them also exposed anyone following. She rode Patience again. Caleb rode a bay gelding named Ira that was bigger and faster, but deferred to his rider with the easy trust of an animal that had been handled right for a long time. Caleb set the pace, faster than comfortable, slower than reckless, and she matched it without complaint. They did not talk for the first hour. There was nothing to say that the situation hadn't already said, and the cold made conversation expensive. She spent the time watching the terrain to the east and thinking through the documents. Not reviewing them, she had them memorized, but thinking through the legal argument, the chain of evidence, the sequence in which a federal judge would need to see it. Her father had always said that a case was only as strong as its weakest presentation. You could have ironclad evidence and lose the room if you told the story in the wrong order. She was still working through the sequence when Caleb said, quietly, "Rider, East Ridge, single horse, not moving." She looked, saw the dark shape against the snow on the ridgeline, maybe a quarter-mile out. Stationary, watching. "How long?" she asked. "Since we left the tree line, 7, 8 minutes." He did not change pace or direction. "If I stop or turn, they know we've seen them. We keep moving." "Is it one of Weston's men?" "Could be a rancher checking his fence line at 4 a.m. in January." A pause. "But probably not." She thought about the postscript. She is the only remaining problem. "They got here faster than you expected." "They're better than I expected." He said it without embarrassment, the way a professional acknowledges another professional. "Which means they didn't come from Garrison. They were already staged somewhere between Garrison and my ranch. Weston or Voss put them in position before you even reached town." She absorbed this. "They knew I was coming this direction." "They knew the general territory. They've been tightening the circle." He kept his eyes forward. "The man on the ridge is watching our direction of travel. He's not going to move until we're past that eastern outcrop, and then he'll signal whoever's behind us." "How long until we're past the outcrop?" 12 minutes. "And then?" "And then we ride hard for 40 minutes to reach the first tree cover in the Beartooth foothills. And once we're in the trees, they lose the visual, and we have options." He looked at her sideways. "Can you ride hard for 40 minutes in this cold?" "Can you?" she said. The almost smile, gone in an instant. "Yes, ma'am." "Then we understand each other." They rode. She kept her eyes forward and her body low against Patience's neck, the way her father had shown her once, years ago, on a different horse, in different trouble. Small target, Maggie. Always make yourself a small target. And she thought about the man on the ridge watching them, and about what it meant that Voss had staged men in position before she even reached Garrison. It meant someone had told him she was in this territory.
It meant the net had been closing for longer than she'd realized. It also meant the documents were even more dangerous than she'd already known, which she had not thought possible. Caleb said nothing. She heard his breathing change slightly, felt the pace increase under her, and Patience matched Ira's rhythm without being asked. When they hit the tree line 43 minutes later, both horses were blowing hard, and her face had gone numb from the cold, and she didn't care about either of those things, because they were inside the trees, and the ridge was behind them, and the dark closed around them like cover. Caleb brought Ira down to a walk, and she matched him. They moved deeper into the trees in silence for another 5 minutes before he stopped. "Dismount," he said quietly. "Let them rest and catch their breath. We have 10 minutes." She swung down and walked Patience in a slow circle the way he was walking Ira, keeping the animal moving enough to cool down without seizing up in the cold. Her legs were shaking slightly from the ride and from the cold, and she pressed her lips together and did not mention it. "You said we have options once we're in the trees," she said. "What options?" "The direct route to Silas Croft's relay station goes through Riddle Pass. That's the route anyone following us would expect." He was watching the tree line behind them. "There's a second way in, longer by 2 hours, that comes around the south face of the first peak and approaches the station from the back. Steeper going, but it doesn't follow any marked trail." "Will they know it?" "Voss's outside men won't. They're from outside the territory. I can tell from the way they stage, they don't know this ground." A pause. "Weston's local deputies might know the pass exists, but they won't know the south face route because it's not a route. It's just a way I've been going since I was 14 because my father showed it to me." She looked at him. "Then we take the south face. It adds 2 hours, and it's hard going in the dark." "So it adds 2 hours." She held his gaze. "Those men on that ridge are not options I want to negotiate with, Mr. Hargrove." He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said, "they're not." They remounted and went south. The south face was everything he'd said and then some. The trail, if it could be called that, was a series of decisions rather than a path. Caleb reading the terrain by moonlight and memory, choosing each step with the confidence of a man who had walked this ground so many times, it lived in his body rather than his mind. She followed exactly in his line, trusting Patience to trust Ira, and she occupied herself by watching how he moved and learning what she could from it. He was not a man who performed competence. He was a man who simply was competent, the way her father had been, the way the best lawyers she'd watched were. No announcement, no theater, just the thing done correctly, and the next thing begun. She had been lied to by competent-seeming men. She knew better than to conflate confidence with trustworthiness. But she also knew, after 20 years of reading documents and the people who produced them, that the postscript in that letter, "She is the only remaining problem," was the kind of line a man writes when he has already decided on violence, and that Caleb Hargrove had read that line and spent the rest of the night awake, checking locks and loading rifles instead of sleeping. That was a kind of document, too, the kind her father had taught her to read. They reached Silas Croft's relay station 2 hours after full dawn, coming in from the south face as planned, and found 3 horses already hitched outside that Caleb looked at for a long moment before he said anything. "Those are relay horses," he said. "Croft keeps a string of them for the mail run." A pause. "The brand on the near one is not Croft's brand." Maggie looked at the horses, looked at the station door. "Stay here," Caleb said. "Absolutely not." He looked at her. "If something's wrong in there," she said, "you need to know what I know, and I need to know what you know in real time. We don't separate." She met his eyes. "You said every decision together. That includes this one." A beat. Then he reached into his saddlebag and came out with a short-barreled revolver that he held out to her, grip first. She took it without hesitation, checked the cylinder the way her father had shown her. Always know what you're holding, Maggie. Always know exactly what you have. And nodded. They went in together. Silas Croft was behind his counter, and he was fine. He was a short, broad man in his 60s, with a white beard and eyes that had been reading weather and trouble for 40 years. And when Caleb came through the door, those eyes went from relief to something complicated in about 2 seconds. There were 2 other men in the room. They were sitting at the far table eating breakfast, and they had the look of men who had been riding hard and were taking advantage of warmth while they had it. They looked up when the door opened. Caleb looked at them. They looked at Caleb. Maggie watched all 3 exchanges happen simultaneously and kept the revolver at her side with her thumb on the hammer. "Caleb Hargrove," Silas said, and his voice was careful in a way that told her the 2 men at the table were the reason for the care. "Been a while." "Silas." Caleb moved to the counter with the easy, unhurried motion of a man who was neither retreating nor threatening. "Cold morning. We could use coffee and whatever you have hot." "Got both." Silas moved to the stove, putting his back to the room in a way that gave him a moment to look directly at Caleb, and then at the 2 men, and then back at Caleb. A fast triangulation that communicated clearly. "I don't know them, and I don't like them here." One of the men at the table was watching Maggie. Not in the way men sometimes watched women, assessingly, dismissively. He was watching the satchel across her body. Just the satchel. His eyes hadn't gone to her face at all. She turned slightly so the satchel was on the side away from him, and she moved 3 steps to the left so that she and Caleb were not standing in a line. Old habit from courthouse work. Her father had taught her to never stand where one motion could reach both of you. "You heading through the pass?" the watching man asked. He addressed Caleb, but his eyes flickered to the satchel again. "South, work to do," Caleb said easily. "You?" "Coming from Billings, heading toward Garrison." The man picked up his coffee cup. "You know a woman named Calloway? Margaret Calloway?" The room was quiet enough that Maggie could hear the fire in the stove. Caleb's expression did not change. Not a single muscle moved in his face, and she understood in that moment exactly why he had been good at his work for Pinkerton. Because she was watching him, and she could not read him. "Can't say I do," Caleb said. "Why?" "Her father had some legal business that got complicated. Family wants to make sure she's safe." The man's eyes went to the satchel one more time. Fast. He thought she didn't notice. She noticed. "Rough country for a woman traveling alone," Caleb said. "That's what concerns us." The man set down his cup. "She'd be carrying some of her father's papers, business documents. The family is very anxious to have them back." Caleb looked at the man with the particular expression she was coming to recognize. Not blank, not hostile. Simply a face that gave nothing away while taking everything in. "I'll keep an eye out," he said. The man looked at Maggie for the first time, directly at her face this time. "And you, miss?" he said. "You seen anyone on the South Pass this morning?" "Just my husband and the horses," she said. She said it before she'd thought it through, and she felt Caleb go very still beside her, without moving a single visible muscle. And she kept her face exactly as neutral as his, and looked at the man at the table with the steady, mildly bored expression of a woman who had been asked a tedious question she had no particular interest in. The man looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at him with the face of a man whose wife has just spoken for him, and who finds nothing unusual about this. "Much obliged," the man said, and went back to his breakfast. Silas brought coffee and 2 plates of salt pork and biscuits to the end of the counter farthest from the 2 men. And Maggie and Caleb stood at the counter and ate in the comfortable silence of 2 people who had decided, without speaking, exactly what they were doing.
When the two men finished their meal and went out to their horses, Silas watched the door close behind them and then leaned across the counter and said, in a voice below the sound of the stove, "Those men rode in an hour ago, asking about the pass conditions and about a woman with red hair carrying a leather bag. I told them the pass was rough going this time of year. Didn't mention anything else." "I'm grateful," Caleb said. "You saved my boy." Silas looked at him. "I've been waiting 4 years to be useful." He shifted his eyes to Maggie. "Whatever you're carrying, young lady, it's worth a great deal to some dangerous people." "It's worth more to the people it can help," she said. Silas looked at her for a moment, with the evaluating look of a man who has been in hard country long enough to know the difference between a person who says the right thing and a person who means it. "Favor to ask," Caleb said. "Name it." "Those 2 men are going to ride toward Garrison, and they're going to meet whoever is coming behind us, and they're going to tell them they saw a man and his wife heading south on the pass road." He paused. "I need them to keep believing that for as long as possible." Silas nodded slowly. "I can mention to the next rider through that I saw a couple heading south toward the Yellowstone Basin. Heading south is all they need to hear." "That's all I need." They were back on the horses and moving within 20 minutes. Maggie waited until the station was fully out of sight behind them before she said anything. "I apologize," she said, "for what I said in there. I should have told you I was going to do that." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "It worked." "That's not the point. We said every decision together. That was a decision, and I made it unilaterally." She kept her voice even. "I apologize." He looked at her sideways. "How did you know I wouldn't contradict you?" "I didn't. It was a risk." She paused. "But that man's eyes went to the satchel 3 times before he looked at my face. He had a description, and he was looking for a woman alone with a leather bag. Giving him a husband was the fastest way to make the description not fit." She looked at Caleb. "And you were the only husband available." Something passed across his face that she couldn't fully read. "Well," he said, "I've been called worse things." She looked at him. "Have you ever actually been married?" The question surprised him. She could tell because it was the first time she'd seen surprise on his face, rather than just the recognition of something he'd already anticipated. He took a moment before answering. "No," he said. "I was engaged once, 1875. She was a good woman, and she deserved better than a man who was gone 8 months out of 12, working cases that he couldn't talk about." He said it plainly, without self-pity. "She married a shopkeeper in Denver, has 3 children. I hope she's happy. I believe she is." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It was the right outcome for everyone." He paused. "You?" "No," she almost laughed. "My father's clients were mostly men who'd been wronged by other men in property disputes. Not the most promising pool." "And the men who weren't clients?" She considered this. "I think most men found it uncomfortable that I could read a land contract faster than they could and tell them exactly where they'd been cheated." She kept her eyes on the trail ahead. "My father found it funny. He'd introduce me to opposing counsel sometimes and watch them realize they were going to lose to a woman who was 23 years old, and he'd stand there with the straightest face." She paused. "He thought it was the best joke he'd ever told." Caleb said nothing for a moment. "He sounds like someone worth knowing," he said. "He was the best person I've known." She said it simply, the way you can only say true things. "Losing him is the largest thing that's ever happened to me. I can't get to the edges of it yet. I just keep working because working is the thing he taught me to do, and doing it is the only way I know to still be connected to him." The horses moved through the trees,
their breath rising in clouds. Every piece of work he'd left unfinished on the ranch. Every fence, every contract, every job he'd meant to get to. Took me 4 months. A pause. It wasn't grief, it was... I needed to complete his sentences, so they didn't just end in the middle. She looked at him. He was watching the trail ahead, but his jaw was set in the way she was learning meant he was feeling something he didn't intend to show. "Yes," she said quietly. "That's exactly it." They rode in silence after that, but it was a different silence than the one they'd started the morning with. The cold was the same. The danger behind them was the same. But something between them had shifted, in the way things shift when two people have been honest with each other, past the point of what was strictly necessary, and both of them feel it, and neither of them says so out loud. They were 2 hours into the afternoon when Caleb pulled up sharply and held up a fist. She stopped Patience immediately, listened. Hoofbeats. Behind them and above them, on the ridge to the east. More than 2 horses this time. "They didn't go to Garrison," Caleb said. "No," she said. "They didn't." He looked at the trail ahead, then at the ridge, then at her. His face had gone back to the controlled assessment she'd first seen in Briggs' store. But underneath it now she could read, because she had spent 2 days learning to read him, the particular calculation of a man who is recalculating odds that have just changed. "There's a mining camp 2 miles ahead," he said. "Abandoned since '76. The main shaft building is stone, solid walls, one way in." He met her eyes. "We can't outrun them now, not on tired horses in this terrain." "Then we don't run," she said. "Miss Calloway, Maggie." She said it for the first time without thinking about it. "My name is Maggie, and I'm not interested in hiding in a mine shaft waiting for rescue." She looked at him steadily. "You said you know these men's pattern. You said Weston's deputies know the marked trails. Tell me what they don't know." He looked at her for a long second. "There's a fork a half-mile ahead," he said slowly. "East Branch looks like the main trail. It's wider, better packed, obvious. But it dead ends at a rock face after 3 miles. He paused. "West Branch is overgrown. Looks like it goes nowhere." "But it doesn't. It comes out above the mining camp on the far side and connects back to the Croft route 4 miles on." He was watching her think. If they follow the East Branch, they lose 3 hours minimum. She looked at the ridge. The hoofbeats were closer. "How long do we have to make the fork before they have a visual on us?" 6 minutes, maybe 7. "Then we have 6 minutes." She looked at him. "Unless you have a better idea." "I don't," he said. Something in his voice, not quite admiration, but something in that direction. "I really don't." "Then let's move." They rode hard for the fork and took the West Branch without slowing down, the overgrown brush closing behind them as though the trail had never been there at all. And Maggie did not look back, because looking back was how people died, and she was not going to die out here before she finished her father's sentences. The West Branch Trail was not a trail. It was a memory. Caleb's memory, stored in his legs and his hands and the way he leaned in the saddle. And Maggie followed it by following him, trusting that the man who had grown up on this mountain knew the difference between a path that went somewhere and a path that went nowhere, even when she could not see it herself. They moved fast and quiet for the first hour. No talking. The brush closed behind them, and the sound of the hoofbeats on the ridge faded, and then disappeared entirely, swallowed by distance and terrain, and the particular silence of a mountain that had been absorbing human trouble for 10,000 years, and had long since stopped being impressed by it. When Caleb finally slowed to a walk, Maggie let out a breath she had been holding for longer than she'd realized. "They took the East Branch," he said. "You're certain?" "Listen." He stopped Ira completely, and she stopped Patience beside him, and she listened. Nothing. The specific nothing of empty terrain with no human movement in it. If they were still on our line, we'd hear them. Sound carries different up here. He looked east, reading something in the air she couldn't read. They're 3 miles that direction right now, moving fast toward a rock face that's going to stop them cold and make them very angry. How long before they figure it out and come back? 2 hours, minimum.
Probably 3. He turned Ira back to the trail. We'll be on the Croft route by then, and moving at a pace they can't make up before dark. She nudged Patience forward. And after dark? There's a ranch 12 miles on the far side of the Croft connection. Man named Garrett Webb. He was one of my father's oldest friends. He doesn't know Weston, and Weston doesn't know him. He's been in this valley since before the county was organized, and he's never had reason to interact with garrison politics. He paused. We can shelter there tonight, and reach Helena by tomorrow afternoon. Tomorrow afternoon. She calculated it involuntarily. 24 hours until they could put the satchel in front of a federal judge. 24 hours was a manageable distance. She had been running for 3 weeks, and 24 hours felt like something she could hold in her hands. Tell me about Helena, Caleb said. Who specifically are we looking for? Judge Amos Whitfield, Federal District Court. My father mentioned his name twice in correspondence. Once when he was describing the legal landscape, and once in a letter to a colleague where he said Whitfield was, and I'm quoting directly, the last honest man between the Missouri River and the Pacific Ocean. She shifted in the saddle. I don't know him personally, but my father's judgment about people was not something I've learned to discount. I know the name, Caleb said. He came through Billings 2 years ago on circuit. Heard 3 cases in 2 days, all involving land disputes, all decided on strict evidentiary reading with no consideration of who had the most money or the most connections. He thought about it. He's the right man. We need him to issue a halt order on Northern Meridian's operations in Custer County while the forgeries are investigated. That stops the clock on any further acquisitions and gives the displaced families a legal basis to challenge their removals. She had worked through this so many times it came out like recitation, but the urgency underneath it was not recited. And we need federal warrants for Weston and Voss before they know we've reached Helena. If they find out we've made it, they'll run. Voss will run, Caleb said. Weston won't. He's lived in Custer County for 20 years. He doesn't have anywhere else to be. He paused. That makes him more dangerous at the end than Voss. She had thought the same thing, but hearing him say it settled the weight of it more solidly. A man with nowhere to run was a man with nothing left to lose. And she had been moving toward that man's territory for 3 weeks. When this is over, she said, and stopped. When this is over, Caleb said. What? She hadn't known she was going to say it until she was already saying it. She finished the thought because she had learned that half-spoken things had a way of becoming heavier than whole ones. I don't know what comes after. I've been so focused on the destination that I haven't thought past it. A pause. My father's house is gone. His practice is gone. I have no office, no city, nowhere that's mine. She said it factually, not for sympathy. I haven't let myself think about it, because thinking about it takes energy I needed for other things. You could rebuild a practice, Caleb said. What you can do with a land contract. There are 100 families in this territory who need exactly that. I know. She looked at the trail ahead. It's not about whether I can. It's about... She stopped again. My father and I used to talk about opening a proper firm together. A real one, with his name and mine on the door. Calloway and Calloway. The words cost her something. She could feel it. That's the version of the future that doesn't exist anymore. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Not the quiet of a man who had nothing to say, but the quiet of a man who was choosing what to say carefully. Calloway, he said finally. That name is going to mean something when this is over. Thomas Calloway is the man who built the case that broke Northern Meridian. His daughter is the one who carried it home." He looked at her steadily. "Calloway and Calloway doesn't have to be the firm your father never got to open. It could be the thing you build in his name, the sentence you finish for him." She looked at him. The morning light was coming in at an angle through the trees, and it caught the side of his face, and she was aware, with the particular clarity that comes from exhaustion and cold and 3 weeks of running, that she was looking at a man who was saying true things to her rather than useful things, and that the difference between those two categories was larger than she had remembered. "You are considerably more than I expected," she said. He looked like he didn't know what to do with that, which she found, against all reasonable consideration, entirely endearing. "Likewise," he said, and looked back at the trail. They reached the Croft connection by mid-afternoon and picked up the pace on the better terrain. The horses were tired but steady, the kind of tired that comes from consistent work rather than damage. And Maggie pressed Patience forward with the knowledge that 12 more miles stood between them and Garrett Webb's ranch and something resembling safety for the night. She was watching the western ridge when she saw the smoke. "Caleb." He had already seen it. He pulled up Ira, and she pulled up beside him, and they both looked at the thin, dark column rising from somewhere below the ridgeline, maybe 2 miles west. "That's not a cook fire," he said. "No." The smoke was too dark, too thick. Something was burning that wasn't meant to burn. "What's out there?" His jaw went tight. "The edge of Pete Alderman's property." She looked at him. "They're burning him out," Caleb said. The words came out flat and controlled, but underneath the control, she could hear the thing that had been building in him since he'd read the documents at her kitchen table 2 nights ago. Not anger exactly. Something larger and colder than anger. He refused to vacate, and they're burning him out. "We can't go there," she said. She said it immediately, and she said it because it was true, and because she knew that if she didn't say it first, he would already be turning Ira west. "Caleb, if we go there, we lose the documents. We lose the case. We lose the only chance those families have, including the Aldermans." "Maggie." "If Weston's men are at that property, they're between us and it. We go west, we ride into them, and we don't get out." She kept her voice level because she needed him to hear the logic and not the desperation underneath it. "The only thing that helps Pete Alderman right now is a federal judge in Helena issuing a halt order. Today. Tomorrow at the latest." He was watching the smoke. His hands on the reins were still, but she could see what the stillness was costing him. "He has a wife," Caleb said. "Margaret. She taught Sunday school for 15 years. I know." She had read their deed. She knew their names and their signatures and the date they had filed their original claim. She knew them through paper, the way her father had always said you came to know people through documents, more honestly than through words, because documents recorded what people actually did rather than what they said they would do. "I know." "I told her it would get sorted." "It will get sorted." She held his gaze when he finally looked at her. "Tomorrow, in Helena, with everything in this bag." She pressed it against her ribs. "But only if we keep moving." He looked at the smoke for 3 more seconds. Then he turned Ira east and set the pace harder than before, and she matched him without a word. They did not speak for a long time after that. The smoke was behind them, and she did not look back at it, and she understood that he was not looking back at it either. Not because it didn't matter, but because looking back right now would make it impossible to keep moving forward. And forward was the only direction that helped anyone. Garrett Webb's ranch appeared in the last gray light of afternoon, and the old man himself was on the porch when they rode in, as though he had been expecting company, or was simply the kind of man who watched the horizon as a matter of habit. He was 70 if he was a day, lean and weathered, with white hair under a battered hat
and the eyes of a man who had seen a great deal and revised his opinions based on what he saw, rather than on what he'd been told to think. He looked at Caleb, and then at Maggie, and then at the satchel, and then back at Caleb. "You look like your father did the winter of '63, he said to Caleb, "which means you're in serious trouble, and you need to get inside."
"That's about right," Caleb said. Inside, over venison stew that was the best thing Maggie had eaten in 3 weeks, Caleb told Garrett Webb the shape of it. Garrett listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been, and when Caleb finished, the old man was quiet for a moment, and then looked at Maggie. "You have the documents?" "Yes, sir." "And you can prove the forgeries?" "Beyond any reasonable doubt, if you'll excuse the legal phrasing." "I won't excuse it. It's the right phrasing." He looked at the satchel. "Thomas Calloway's daughter." She looked at him. "You knew my father?" "Knew of him. He wrote to me 2 years ago, asking about deed practices in this valley, whether I'd seen anything unusual with county recording." Garrett wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I wrote back that everything seemed proper here, but I'd had 3 neighbors mention confusion about paperwork near Garrison." He paused. "I have wondered since whether I should have looked harder at what I was telling him." Maggie felt the echo of the night before. Caleb saying, "I told her it would get sorted," and understood that this was what Northern Meridian's operation had been designed to produce. A web of half-seen things and incomplete information, so that no single person had enough of the picture to act. And by the time anyone did have enough, the machine had moved on. "You told him the truth as you knew it," she said. "That's all anyone can do." Garrett looked at her for a moment. "You sound like him." She could not answer that. She looked at the stew and concentrated on eating. After supper, Garrett showed them 2 rooms. He did it without commentary or question, which she appreciated, and she found herself thinking that the people who had helped them on this journey, Silas Croft reading the room at his relay station, Garrett Webb asking no unnecessary questions, were the same kind of people her father had spent his life trying to protect. People who dealt honestly and worked hard and wanted nothing more complicated than to be left alone to do so. Northern Meridian had made an enemy of every one of them. They just didn't know it yet. She was at the small desk in her room, working through the documents one final time, organizing the presentation sequence for Judge Whitfield, when there was a knock at the door. "It's me," Caleb said. She opened the door. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, and when he held one out to her, she looked at it with genuine wariness. "Garrett made it," he said. "It's better than mine." She took it, tasted it. It was considerably better. "What is it?" "I don't know. He wouldn't tell me. He said it was a proprietary method developed over 50 years of bad winters." He looked at the documents spread on the desk. "How does it look?" "Good. Better than good." She sat back down, and he leaned in the doorframe rather than coming in, which she noted and appreciated. "I've been thinking about the presentation sequence. The judge needs to see the forgery mechanism first, the notary seal evidence, because that establishes the methodology and makes everything else legible. Then the corporate correspondence establishing authorization. Then the individual deed transfers." She looked up. 14 forged deeds, 2 murders documented by circumstantial chain, and a letter with Weston's name on it, signed by a Chicago executive. In the right sequence, that's not a complicated case. It's an overwhelming one. Then tomorrow you walk into that courthouse and you end this. "We walk in," she said. He looked at her. "You're a material witness," she said. "Your land is on their acquisition schedule. You have direct knowledge of Voss's methods and Weston's involvement. The judge needs your testimony as well as my documents." She met his eyes steadily. We end this together. That's what we agreed." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his face. That complicated expression she'd been seeing more frequently. The one that sat between assessment and something warmer that he clearly hadn't decided what to do with. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And you don't have to answer it." "Ask." "Back at Crofts Station, when you told that man I was your husband," he said it carefully, not accusingly. "You said it was tactical, the fastest way to change the description." "It was." "I know it was." He looked at the doorframe. "I want to know if it was only that." The fire in the small stove filled the silence. Maggie looked at this man in the doorway. This careful, competent, honest man who had walked a perimeter in a blizzard to keep her safe and read a dead man's documents by lamplight, and chosen a route his father had shown him when he was 14, because it was the route nobody else knew. This man who said true things instead of useful things, and had a horse named Ira, and made genuinely terrible coffee, and had looked at a smoke column rising from his neighbor's burning property and chosen, at great cost, to keep riding east. "No," she said. "It was not only that." He looked at her, the almost smile, but this time it didn't disappear. It stayed, quiet and careful, like something that had decided to trust the ground it was standing on. "All right," he said. "Get some sleep. Helena tomorrow." "Caleb." He looked back from the doorway. "My father would have liked you," she said. "He had a very high bar for that. I want you to know you clear it." He stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression she had no framework for. Not the controlled Pinkerton face, not the almost smile. Something rawer and more unguarded than either. "Good night, Maggie," he said quietly. "Good night." He pulled the door closed, and she listened to his footsteps move down the hall, and she sat at the small desk with her father's documents and her father's case, and the specific warmth of a feeling she had not expected to find in the middle of any of this. And she thought, for the first time since the lamp fire, about what came after. Not as a blank space, not as a question without an answer, as a possibility. She straightened the last stack of documents, capped the pen, and blew out the lamp. In the dark, she held the oilcloth letter one more time and did not open it, just held it, and thought about what it meant to finish a sentence for someone who couldn't finish it themselves. Then she set it down and lay back and closed her eyes. And for the second night running, she was asleep in minutes. Which was, she thought, before sleep took her entirely. Its own kind of evidence about the man sleeping down the hall. Tomorrow was Helena. Tomorrow they finished it. They left Garrett Webb's ranch before sunrise, and the old man stood on his porch in the cold and watched them go without ceremony, which was exactly right. He had fed them and sheltered them and asked nothing in return. And when Caleb reached down from the saddle to shake his hand, Garrett held it for a moment and said, "Finish it clean. Your father would want it done clean." "Yes, sir," Caleb said. Maggie looked at the old man from Patience's back and said, "When this is over, Mr. Webb, you'll receive a letter from the federal court confirming that the Northern Meridian operation in this territory has been halted. I want you to have it on paper." Garrett Webb looked at her for a moment with those revised opinion eyes. "Thomas Calloway's daughter," he said again, but this time it wasn't a question. It was a verdict. They rode. The morning was clear and sharp, the storm 3 days behind them now, the sky the particular blue of high Montana winter that looked painted rather than real. Maggie kept the satchel pressed against her body and her mind on Helena, and did not allow herself to think about anything else. 20 miles. 6 hours at this pace. 6 hours in a federal courthouse and a judge her father had called the last honest man between the Missouri and the Pacific.
She had been running toward this for 3 weeks. She could feel the end of it in her chest like a physical thing, a tightness that was equal parts anticipation and terror, because she understood with the clear logic of someone who had spent her life reading what documents actually said, that winning in the courthouse and surviving the approach were two entirely different problems. "Weston," she said. Caleb looked at her. "You said yesterday he won't run, that he has nowhere to go." She kept her eyes on the trail. "What does that mean for us when we reach Helena?" "It means the moment we walk into that courthouse, someone tells someone, and that information reaches Garrison inside 3 hours." He said it plainly, without softening. "Weston will know we made it before Whitfield has finished reading the first document." "And his response?" "His response depends on whether he believes the case is strong enough to convict him." Caleb paused. "A guilty man with resources and a badge has options a guilty man without resources doesn't have. He could attempt to discredit the documents. He could attempt to discredit you, question your stability, your motives, suggest a grieving daughter fabricated evidence against the men who supposedly killed her father." "He'll try that first," Maggie said. "It's what Voss would advise. Attack the witness before attacking the evidence." "Yes, and if that fails, then he does something that isn't legal and isn't careful." She had thought about this. She had thought about it every night for 3 weeks, and she had kept thinking about it because the only thing more dangerous than not knowing what was coming was pretending it wasn't coming. Which is why the sequence matters. We don't just hand the documents to Whitfield and walk away. We need the halt order and the warrants issued before Weston has time to act. She looked at Caleb. "How fast can a federal judge move when the evidence in front of him is overwhelming?" "Whitfield?" he considered. "Fast. He's not a man who performs deliberation. He reads, he decides, he acts." A pause. "But we have to get in front of him first. His clerk controls access, and his clerk is a cautious man by reputation, who does not enjoy being approached without prior arrangement." "Then we don't approach the clerk," Maggie said. "We approach Whitfield directly. He's not easy to reach outside the courtroom. I know where he'll be at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning in January." She had thought about this too. "My father's correspondence mentioned that Whitfield keeps a standing habit of coffee at the Placer Hotel dining room before his 11 o'clock docket. Has done it for 6 years. It's not a secret. It's just information that most people don't have, because most people don't read correspondence carefully." She looked at Caleb. "We reach Helena by 10 o'clock. We walk into that dining room, and I put 3 documents in front of him before his clerk knows we exist." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That is either the best approach I've heard, or the most reckless." "Coming from the man who took me on a trail that wasn't a trail, to lose professional trackers in a January blizzard," she said. "I'll take that as a compliment." He looked at her sideways, the not-quite smile. "Yes, ma'am." They made Helena at 9:47. The town hit them like a wall after 4 days in open country. Noise and movement, and the smell of coal smoke and horse traffic, and civilization in all its complicated density. Maggie had grown up in St. Louis, which was larger by half. But after the mountains, Helena felt enormous and exposed in equal measure. Too many windows, too many angles, too many people who might be no one, and too many who might not be. Caleb read her without being told. He moved Ira closer to Patience as they entered the main street, close enough that their stirrups nearly touched. Not a romantic gesture, a tactical one. She knew the difference by now, and she knew that he knew she knew, and neither of them said anything about it. The Placer Hotel was 3 blocks from the federal courthouse, and it was exactly what her father's correspondence had described. A solid brick building with a dining room that served the professional class of Helena, and had been doing so for 15 years. The kind of place where a federal judge could have coffee in peace, because everyone in the room had enough sense not to disturb him. They left the horses at the rail outside, and Maggie checked the satchel one final time. Documents in sequence. Notary seal comparison on top. Corporate correspondence at the bottom of the stack. She had rehearsed the presentation so many times that the words came out in her sleep, and she knew it, because she had heard herself saying them in the gray half-consciousness of the past 3 mornings. "Ready?" Caleb said. "I've been ready for 3 weeks," she said. "Let's go." Judge Amos Whitfield was exactly where her father's correspondent said he would be. Corner table, back to the wall, coffee and a newspaper. A compact man in his early 60s, with sharp gray eyes and the unhurried posture of someone who had long since stopped needing to perform authority, because the real thing didn't require a performance. He looked up when they approached, not with irritation, with assessment. The same kind of fast triangulation she'd seen in Caleb. The same reading the room speed. A man who had spent decades evaluating what walked through his door. Maggie did not wait for an invitation. She sat down across from him, set the satchel on the table, and took out the top 3 documents. "Judge Whitfield, my name is Margaret Calloway. My father was Thomas Calloway, a lawyer from St. Louis who was investigating land fraud in Custer County when he was killed 3 weeks ago in a fire that was not accidental." She set the first document in front of him. "I have 19 forged land deeds, corporate correspondence authorizing the forgeries and the killings, and direct documentation of Sheriff Dale Weston of Custer County as a paid agent of the Northern Meridian Land Company." She set the second document beside the first. "I need a halt order on Northern Meridian's operations in this territory, and federal warrants for Weston and a lawyer named Harlan Voss before they know I've reached this city." She set the third document down. "And I need them today." The dining room continued around them. Coffee was poured at other tables. Silverware clicked against china. Judge Whitfield looked at the 3 documents in front of him with the stillness of a man who had trained himself not to react until he had enough information to react accurately. He read the first document, then the second, then the third. He went back to the second and read a section again. Then he looked up at Maggie. "The notary seal," he said. 14 of the 19 forged deeds used the same physical seal copied from a legitimate 1876 transfer. I have the source document and the forgeries side by side. The seal impression is identical down to a hairline crack in the lower left quadrant that cannot be reproduced except by using the exact same physical object. She held his gaze. "The forgeries are not sophisticated, Judge. They were designed to withstand casual scrutiny, not forensic examination. Nobody expected someone to examine them forensically." "Your father trained you?" "Since I was 12. Whitfield looked at Caleb. "And you?" "Caleb Hargrove. My ranch is in the Northern Meridian acquisition schedule. I'm a former Pinkerton agent with 6 years of investigative experience, and I've been present for Miss Calloway's analysis of every document in that satchel over the past 3 days." He kept his voice level. "I'm prepared to testify to everything." Whitfield folded his hands on the table. He looked at the documents and then at the 2 people across from him, and Maggie watched him think, with the disciplined patience of someone who understood that this particular moment was the one everything had been aimed at, and that the only thing left to do was let it land. "You said Weston will know you've reached Helena within 3 hours of your courthouse appearance," Whitfield said. "Yes, sir." "Then we don't go to the courthouse." He stood up, folded the 3 documents carefully, and put them in his coat pocket. "I'm going to ask you to follow me to a location where I can review the complete documentation without anyone knowing where I am. If the evidence is what you say it is," he looked at Maggie with those sharp gray eyes, "and I suspect it is, I will issue the halt order and the warrants from there, and have them in the hands of federal marshals before noon." Maggie looked at him.
"You believe me?"
"Miss Calloway, I have been a federal judge for 11 years, and before that a prosecutor for 14. I have heard a great deal of testimony from a great many people." He picked up his hat from the chair beside him. "Your father raised someone who leads with the seal evidence rather than the emotional narrative. That is not the approach of a fabricator. That is the approach of someone who understands that the document proves the case, and the story only explains it." He paused at the edge of the table. "I also knew your father by reputation. He was precise and honest and thorough, and I never once heard anyone in the legal community question his integrity." He looked at her directly. "His daughter walks in here carrying 3 weeks of survival and the complete evidentiary record. I believe you." She had not known until that moment how much she needed someone with the authority to matter to say exactly that. She felt something give way in her chest. Not collapse, not break. Give way. The way a knot gives way when the right tension is applied in the right direction. And she pressed her lips together and breathed through it and said, "Thank you." Whitfield nodded once. "Now let's go finish this." The next 2 hours were the most concentrated work of Maggie's life. They went to the private office of a retired lawyer named Coleman, who was Whitfield's oldest friend in Helena, and who asked no questions beyond, "How much paper do you need?" and produced a writing table and a full lamp and left them to it. Whitfield read every document in the satchel in sequence. Every time he had a question, Maggie answered it. Every time he wanted clarification on the legal mechanism, she explained it. Caleb sat to her left and corroborated what he'd witnessed directly and added what he knew about the territory and the men involved. It was, she thought, the conversation her father had been trying to have for 6 months. She was having it for him. At 11:43, Whitfield set down the last document, straightened the stack, and looked at her across the table. 14 provably forged deeds, he said. Corporate authorization for illegal acquisition by, and I'm quoting, any means necessary. Sheriff Weston named as a contracted agent by name and badge number. 2 deaths documented by circumstantial chains sufficient for a grand jury. He paused. Your father built a thorough case, Miss Calloway. We built it together, she said. I just carried it home. Whitfield wrote for 20 minutes. When he was done, he had produced a halt order on all Northern Meridian Land Company operations in Custer County, and 2 federal warrants, one for Dale Weston, one for Harlan Voss, and a sealed letter to the Chief Federal Marshal in Helena, authorizing immediate action. He signed all 4 documents, folded the warrants into separate envelopes, and handed the complete package to the marshal's deputy who had appeared at Coleman's door at Whitfield's request, and who had clearly been given enough information to understand the urgency, because he left at a pace that was close to running. Whitfield looked at the satchel. I need to retain the original documents as evidence. Yes, she had known this was coming. She reached into the satchel and began to transfer the organized stacks to the table, one by one. Each stack she set down felt like setting down weight she had been carrying so long she had stopped knowing it was there. When the satchel was empty, she held it for a moment, the leather soft from 3 weeks of handling, warm from her body, and then set it on the table with the rest. The federal court will provide you with a certified receipt for every document, Whitfield said. Your father's work will be formally entered into the evidentiary record under his name. She looked at the stacks. Thomas Calloway, she said. Lead counsel. Thomas Calloway, Whitfield agreed. Lead counsel. She pressed her lips together, nodded once. They were outside Coleman's office when the news reached them. One of Whitfield's marshals came at a trot, slightly out of breath, and reported that federal deputies had reached Garrison by telegraph relay and coordinated with territorial authorities, that Harlan Voss had been taken into custody at the Northern Meridian offices in Billings without resistance, and that Sheriff Dale Weston— He paused. "Weston," Caleb said. "He was found at the county recorder's office," the marshal said. He'd gone there to destroy records when he got word the federal marshals were moving. Deputy caught him in the act. A pause. "He didn't come quietly." "Is anyone hurt?" Maggie asked. Deputy took a graze on the arm. Nothing serious. Weston's in custody. The marshal looked at the two of them. "It's done." Maggie stood on the frozen street outside Coleman's office in Helena, Montana, on a January afternoon with the sun coming in low and cold and brilliant, and she understood with a clarity that was almost physical that it was done. The documents were in a federal court. The warrants were served. The men who had killed her father were in custody. The machine that had displaced 19 families from their land had been stopped by a federal halt order that would stand until a judge dismissed it. And no judge would dismiss it because the evidence was overwhelming and the case was sound, and her father had built it correctly, even knowing the risk he was taking. She felt Caleb's hand close around hers. Not gently, not tentatively, firmly, the way a man holds something he has decided to hold. And she looked down at their joined hands and then up at his face. "You all right?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Ask me in an hour." "I'll ask you in an hour," he said. "And tomorrow, and the day after that." She looked at him. "Is that an offer, Mr. Hargrove?" "It is." He said it the way he said everything that mattered, plainly, without theater, with the full weight of a man who did not say things he didn't mean. "I have a ranch that needs rebuilding after 3 months of fighting Northern Meridian alone. I have a neighbor named Pete Alderman who is going to need help reclaiming his property, and I intend to see that through personally. And I have—" He paused, the careful pause she'd come to recognize as him choosing his words with the precision he applied to everything. "I have considerable interest in knowing what Margaret Calloway decides to do next. Whatever that is. Wherever that is." "You said Calloway could mean something in this territory when this is over." "I believe that." "Calloway and Calloway," she said. "I've been thinking about that. What my father wanted." She looked at their joined hands. "He wanted it to be the two of us, his name and mine." She paused. "I think maybe what he wanted was someone to do this work beside. Someone who understood it the way he understood it." She looked up at Caleb. "He was particular about people. He had a very high bar." "You told me that last night." "I'm telling you again." She met his eyes steadily. "Because I want to be clear about what I mean when I say you clear it." He looked at her for a long moment with that unguarded expression she'd first seen in the doorway of Garrett Webb's guest room. Not the Pinkerton face, not the almost smile, the one underneath both of those that she suspected very few people had ever been allowed to see. "There's a preacher in Helena," he said. "I'm not suggesting anything precipitous. I'm noting a fact." She looked at him for a long moment. "You are a great deal more than I expected," she said again. "I want you to know that hasn't changed." "Neither has anything I said at that kitchen table 3 nights ago." He held her gaze. "Every decision together. No exceptions." "Then here is my decision," she said. "I'm going to spend the next month making sure every one of those 19 families has the legal documentation to reclaim their land. I'm going to stand in the federal court in Custer County when Weston and Voss go to trial, and I'm going to present every piece of evidence my father and I built together, and I'm going to make sure the jury understands exactly what was done to those people, and why it can never be done again." She kept his gaze. "And I'm going to do all of that from somewhere that is mine. Not a boarding house, not a temporary arrangement. Mine.
"The ranch is 7 miles west of Garrison," he said. "It is considerably larger than one person needs." "I've seen the library," she said. "Your mother's books." "They are, as I told you the first night. Yours, if you want them." She was quiet for a moment. The sun was dropping toward the western peaks, and the cold was sharpening the way it did in late afternoon in January in Montana. And she was standing in the street of an unfamiliar city, holding the hand of a man she had known for 4 days, who had walked a perimeter in a blizzard, and read her father's documents by lamplight, and chosen a route nobody else knew, and said he did that right, with no audience and nothing to gain from it. Her father had said once that you recognized the right people the way you recognized the right document, not because it said what you wanted to hear, but because every element of it held up under examination, and the closer you looked, the more sound it became. She had been looking closely at Caleb Hargrove for 4 days. Everything held up. "I'm going to need a proper desk," she said. "A large one. In that room with the bookshelves. I'll build you one. And I'll need it understood that my work is my work, that what I do in that room is as important as anything done on the ranch." "Maggie," he said her name quietly, "I read every document in that satchel. I watched you take 14 forged deeds and a postscript about murder and build an airtight federal case in the middle of a Montana blizzard while being hunted by professional trackers." He paused. "If I had any inclination to underestimate what you do in that room, I lost it somewhere on the south face of the Beartooth." She felt the knot in her chest give way a little further. "The coffee," she said. "I'll need better coffee." "I told you it was terrible. You offered to improve it." "I said Garrett's was better than mine." "I'll take that as a commitment to ongoing improvement." He almost smiled. And then, this time, he did smile. Fully, completely, the real thing. And it changed his face in a way that she filed away carefully, because she understood instinctively that she was not going to see it often, and that made it worth remembering precisely. "All right," he said. "Let's go home." They collected the horses from the rail, and they rode west out of Helena as the sun touched the peaks and turned the snow to copper and rose. And Maggie rode Patience for the last time on a borrowed saddle, with her father's empty satchel across her body, and her father's case filed in a federal courthouse behind her. And she thought about what it meant to finish a sentence for someone who couldn't finish it themselves. And she thought it meant this: not just the evidence delivered, and the warrants served, and the machines stopped, but this, the part that came after, the continuing part, the part her father had been building toward when he said Calloway and Calloway, with the straightest face and the best joke he'd ever told. She was going to build it. Different than he'd planned, larger than he'd planned, in a valley in Montana, with a man who made terrible coffee and knew trails nobody else knew, and said true things instead of useful ones. She was going to build it, and it was going to carry his name. And she was going to make sure every family in Custer County whose deed had been stolen got it back. And when she stood in court and spoke her father's evidence into the record, she was going to say his name first, clearly, the way he had taught her. Lead with what's strongest, Maggie. Always lead with what's strongest. And Thomas Calloway, who had been right about almost everything, had been most right about this. The law needed more people who could read what was actually written. His daughter was one of them, and she was not done.